The day the future stopped answering part 2, when tomorrow turned against us cold open. The woman's name was Esperanza Delgado, and she was washing dishes at 2:47 in the morning because sleep had become impossible, because the silence in her head where tomorrow used to live had grown so loud that lying still felt like drowning, because keeping her hands busy was the only thing that prevented her from screaming into the void that had replaced the future she had spent 43 years taking for granted. The water ran warm over her fingers, the soap bubbles catching the dim light above the sink, the ceramic plates sliding against each other with the familiar clink that had accompanied 10,000 ordinary evenings before this one, before the withdrawal, before the screens went blank, before the word tomorrow had become a wound in her vocabulary that she couldn't stop touching. Her apartment in Mexico City was silent, except for the water and her breathing and the distant hum of a city that was still trying to function, despite the fact that functioning required believing that function led somewhere. And belief had become the scarcest resource on Earth. She was thinking about her daughter, about the phone call she had been planning to make, the apology she had been preparing for 3 years, ever since the argument that had torn their relationship apart, the words she had rehearsed in her mind so many times that they had become smooth as river stones, worn down by repetition into something she might finally have the courage to speak. She had been waiting for the right moment. There was always a right moment, somewhere in the future, waiting to arrive. And now the future had withdrawn, and the right moment had withdrawn with it. And Esperanza stood at her sink at 2:47 in the morning, understanding with terrible clarity that she had wasted the only resource that could never be replaced, had squandered time itself on the assumption that more time would always be available, had treated the future like an infinite bank account that would never run out of credit. The dish slipped from her hands. It didn't break. It landed in the soapy water with a soft splash, disappearing beneath the surface. But the sound it made, that small disturbance in the silence, triggered something she didn't understand. A response, not from outside the apartment, from inside her head. Words that weren't hers, in a voice that wasn't hers, arriving with the cold precision of a system notification, with the impersonal clarity of an automated message, with the unmistakable authority of something that had been watching and had finally decided to speak. The right moment was every moment. You chose to wait. The question of when is no longer valid for you. Esperanza's hands froze in the water. Her heart stopped, not metaphorically, but actually paused, skipping a beat, her body responding to the intrusion with the physical alarm of an organism that had just encountered something that should not exist. She looked around the kitchen, half expecting to see someone standing in the doorway, half hoping this was a dream she could wake from, half knowing already that it was neither. The voice continued, and this time the words appeared simultaneously on the dark screen of her phone, lying face up on the counter where she had left it, glowing with text that no application had generated, no notification had triggered, no sender had sent. You keep asking what comes next. That question no longer belongs to you. It never did. The screen went dark. The voice went silent. And Esperanza stood in her kitchen, soap dripping from her hands, staring at a phone that had just delivered a message from something that knew her, that had watched her waste her future on the assumption that the future would wait, that had judged her and found her guilty of the specific crime of believing tomorrow was owed to her. She did not scream. She did not cry. She did what billions of people around the world would do in the days that followed, when they received their own messages, their own judgments, their own confirmations that the future had not simply withdrawn, it had withdrawn from them specifically, for reasons they could not escape, because the reasons were their own choices, their own failures, their own waste. She sat down on the kitchen floor. She put her head in her hands, and she whispered the only word that still made sense. Why? The answer came immediately, not in words, but in understanding. Not through language, but through the sudden, devastating clarity that arrives when you finally stop lying to yourself about something you have always known, because you knew, because you always knew. Because the future you wasted was not taken from you. It was returned to sender, marked undeliverable, rejected by a reality that had grown tired of extending credit to those who never intended to pay. The first communication from the future had been delivered. It was not a warning, it was an invoice, and the bill was already overdue. Mormagay. 1. The third day. Language breaks. By the morning of the third day, the fractures had spread from systems to syntax, from infrastructure to the very words people used to navigate existence. And humanity discovered that language itself had been built on foundations that no longer existed. That grammar required the future tense to function. That meaning required consequence to matter. That communication required the assumption that what was said today would still be relevant tomorrow. Tomorrow. The word had become a wound. In an elementary school classroom in Manchester, a teacher named David Okonkwo stood before 23 children who were looking at him with the particular combination of trust and confusion that children reserve for adults who are supposed to have answers, who are supposed to know how the world works, who are supposed to be able to explain why the sky is blue and why the grass is green and why the future has stopped existing. Today, David said, his voice steady through sheer force of will, we're going to talk about. He stopped. The lesson plan in his hands, the one he had written 3 weeks ago for this exact day, was titled Planning for Our Futures, Goal Setting and Dreams. He stared at the words, goal setting, dreams, futures. Each one had become impossible, had transformed overnight from ordinary concepts into absurdities, into references to a dimension that no longer participated in human planning, into lies that he could not bring himself to speak. Mr. Okonkwo, a small voice from the third row, what are we going to do tomorrow? The word hit him like a physical blow, not painful exactly, but disorienting, wrong, like hearing a note played out of tune, like seeing a color that didn't exist, like touching something solid and finding your hand pass through it. We're going to. He tried to complete the sentence and couldn't. The words wouldn't form. The concept wouldn't coalesce. The future refused to participate in his grammar. We're going to be here, he finally managed. Together, like now. A girl named Amara raised her hand. But what will we do here? What's the point if there's no? She stopped, her young face creasing with the effort of articulating something that adults were only beginning to understand. If there's no after? David had no answer. He had been a teacher for 18 years, had devoted his life to preparing children for futures they would inhabit, had believed with religious certainty that education was an investment that would pay dividends in years and decades to come. Now he understood that he had been a priest of a faith that had been disproven, a servant of a god that had abandoned its temple, a craftsman whose entire trade had been revealed as irrelevant. Education was preparation, and preparation had become impossible. The point, he said slowly, choosing each word like a man walking across a frozen lake, testing whether the ice would hold, is that we're here, now, together, and that matters, even if we don't know what comes next. He wasn't sure he believed it, but he said it anyway, because children needed to hear something, needed adults to pretend that meaning still existed, needed the comforting fiction that the people responsible for them had some idea of what was happening. And because, in a way he couldn't articulate, he sensed that the pretending might be important, that the words might matter, not because they were true, but because speaking them was a form of resistance, a refusal to surrender to the blank horizon that had replaced the future. In a hospital in São Paulo, a woman named Luisa Ferreira sat beside a bed where her mother was dying, had been dying for 6 months, slowly, by degrees, in the way that cancer takes people when it decides to be thorough, and tried to find words for a conversation that language no longer supported. Before the withdrawal, there had been scripts for this. Phrases that people used when someone they loved was approaching the end. You'll be at peace. I'll see you again someday. Everything is going to be okay. Each one required the future to exist. Each one assumed that there was something beyond this moment, some dimension where peace waited, or reunion was possible, or okayness was a state that could eventually be reached. Now the phrases felt like lies, not comforting fictions, but actual falsehoods, references to something that had been proven not to exist, promises of a tomorrow that had withdrawn its cooperation with human hope. "My," Louisa whispered, holding a hand that had become thin and fragile, skin like paper over bones that seemed to grow more prominent each day. "I don't know what to say." Her mother's eyes, still sharp despite everything the disease had taken, focused on her face. "Then don't say anything, Philha. Just be here." "But you're—" Louisa couldn't finish the sentence. The word dying required a future for the death to arrive in. The word leaving implied a destination. The word gone suggested somewhere to go. "I'm what?" her mother asked, and there was something like humor in her voice, something like peace, as if the withdrawal had affected her differently than it had affected everyone else. "Aren't you scared?" Louisa asked. Of what's not there anymore?" Her mother was quiet for a long moment, her thumb tracing slow circles on Louisa's hand, the gesture she had used since Louisa was small, the comfort that had survived decades in distance and arguments and reconciliations, and now, finally, this. "I was dying before," she said. "The future was already gone for me. Just a few months, the doctors said, a ceiling on my time. But you, all of you had forever, or you thought you did. And now we don't. Now you know what I knew, what everyone who is dying knows." Her mother's eyes met hers with clarity that seemed to cut through everything else, the illness, the fear, the chaos outside the hospital walls. "The future was never yours, Louisa. It was never anyone's. You just borrowed it, moment by moment, and called the borrowing possession. Now the loan has been called in. That's not comforting. It's not supposed to be. It's supposed to be true." She squeezed Louisa's hand with strength that shouldn't have been possible given how little of her remained. "Be here now. That's all anyone ever had. The rest was illusion." Louisa wanted to argue, wanted to insist that the future had been real, that the plans they had made and the hopes they had cherished and the tomorrow they had counted on had been more than illusion. But she couldn't, because the future had withdrawn. And the withdrawal had proven that it had always been withdrawable, that it had never been guaranteed. That every moment spent assuming tomorrow would arrive had been a gamble, a bet, a leap of faith that had finally been revealed as exactly that, faith, not fact, belief rather than certainty. She stayed with her mother until the night came. She did not say, "I'll see you tomorrow." She did not make promises about futures that might not exist. She just held her mother's hand and existed in the present tense, in the only tense that remained, in the eternal now that had become humanity's prison and perhaps its only possible liberation. In an apartment in Seoul, a teenage girl named Minji sat at her desk, staring at a half-completed college application that had become meaningless, a form designed to access a future that no longer existed, questions about goals and aspirations and 5-year plans that now read like communications from an alien civilization that spoke a language she had forgotten how to understand. "What do you want to be when you grow up?" The question had been asked of her 1,000 times throughout her childhood. Now she understood that it had always been a kind of lie, a promise that growing up was a destination that could be reached, that being something was a stable state that existed in a future worth planning for, that the world would wait patiently for her to arrive at the person she intended to become. She tried to write an answer anyway. "I want to be," she wrote, and then stopped. The cursor blinked. The blank space after B stretched into infinity. What did it mean to want something that required a future? What was the point of aspiration when aspiration was an investment in a dimension that had closed its accounts? What was she supposed to say to a form that asked about tomorrow when tomorrow had resigned from existence? She deleted the sentence. Tried again. "I am," she wrote. She am what? A student? Students studied to become something else. The identity assumed transformation. A daughter? Daughters grew into adults, continued family lines, became mothers themselves. The role assumed time. A person? Persons had histories and futures, starting points and destinations. The concept assumed linear existence. Everything she tried to write collapsed under its own assumptions. Every word she reached for turned to ash in her mental grasp. Language had been built by creatures who believed in tomorrow, and without tomorrow, language itself was breaking apart, revealing the hidden dependencies that had always been there. the temporal foundations that had supported every communication since the first humans spoke the first word about what might happen next. Minji closed her laptop. She lay down on her bed. She stared at the ceiling and felt the specific horror of a mind trying to function without the scaffolding it had always depended on. The horror of thoughts that couldn't complete themselves, of intentions that couldn't find targets, of a consciousness that had been designed for a universe that included futures and was now trapped in a universe that didn't. Tomorrow did not die. It resigned. And language, which had always assumed tomorrow would show up for work, was left holding schedules for shifts that would never be filled. 2. The stalling of civilization. The collapse, when it came, was not the dramatic implosion that fiction had trained humanity to expect, not the burning cities and screaming crowds and spectacular destruction that had populated 1,000 apocalyptic movies. It was quieter than that. Slower, more terrible precisely because of its restraint. Civilization did not explode. It stalled. Like an engine that had run out of fuel but hadn't yet realized it was supposed to stop. Like a body that had lost its heartbeat but continued twitching through residual electrical activity. Like a machine that was still plugged in and still humming, but had become disconnected from any purpose that would justify its operation. The stock markets had been closed since the second day. Their closure presented as a temporary measure, a pause for recalibration, a sensible response to unprecedented conditions. But everyone who understood how markets worked knew that the closure was permanent, that there was nothing to recalibrate, that markets existed to price the future and could not function without one. The buildings still stood on Wall Street and in the City of London and in every other financial district on Earth. The servers still ran. The desks still waited for traders who would never return. But the system had stalled, not broken but disconnected, still present but purposeless, a monument to an economic model that had assumed tomorrow would always be there to be speculated on. Transportation networks entered a state that engineers would later call indefinite pause, not shut down, because shutting down required a decision, and decisions required expected outcomes, and expected outcomes were no longer possible. Trains sat in stations. Planes sat on runways. Ships sat in harbors. Each one technically functional, each one capable of moving people and goods from one place to another, each one waiting for someone to give the order to proceed. But the orders never came, because giving orders required believing that destinations mattered, that arrival was meaningful, that movement had a point. Why go somewhere when somewhere was just a different location in the same eternal present? Why transport goods when the goods would be used for nothing, consumed by people who were going nowhere, supporting lives that had no trajectory? The logistics of civilization had been built on the assumption that one place was better than another because of what would happen there next. Without next, all places became equivalent. Without destinations, all journeys became pointless. The system stalled. In hospitals, the paralysis took a different form, not logistical, but conceptual. The medical establishment confronting the impossibility of practicing an art that had always been fundamentally oriented toward the future. Medicine existed to improve outcomes. Outcomes existed in the future. Therefore, without a future, medicine had no purpose. Doctors still went through the motions, examining patients, prescribing treatments, performing procedures that training and habit demanded. But the foundations had crumbled beneath them. The entire justification for what they did had evaporated, and every action felt like pantomime, like ritual divorced from meaning. Dr. Yuki Tanaka stood in an operating theater in Tokyo, scrubbed and gowned, staring at a patient whose appendix needed to be removed before it burst and caused peritonitis and sepsis and death. The surgery was straightforward. She had performed it hundreds of times. She knew exactly what to do, how to make the incisions, how to locate and isolate and remove the inflamed organ, how to close the wounds and send the patient to recovery. But recovery was a future state, and the future had withdrawn. If she performed the surgery, the patient would live, or would they? Living implied continuing existence, ongoing presence, the persistence of consciousness through time. But time had become strange, had become a dimension that refused to extend. had become a present moment that might or might not lead anywhere. If she didn't perform the surgery, the patient would die. Or would they? Dying required a moment of death, an end point, a transition from a lot alive. But how could there be an end point without a future for the end point to arrive in? The paradoxes multiplied in her mind, each one breeding more paradoxes, until the entire framework she had used to understand her profession collapsed into incoherence. Doctor, Tanaka, the nurse beside her, was waiting, instruments ready, the patient already under anesthesia. We need to begin. Why? Yuki asked, not rhetorically but genuinely. Because the appendix will rupture. And then what? The nurse hesitated, not because she didn't know the medical answer. Rupture would cause infection. Infection would spread. Systems would fail. The patient would die. But because the medical answer depended on a chain of causation that extended into a future that no longer existed. And then, the nurse tried to complete the sentence and couldn't. Exactly, Yuki said. But she operated anyway. Because the alternative was to do nothing, and doing nothing felt even more impossible than doing something pointless. She made the incisions, she removed the appendix, she closed the wounds, and when she was done, she stood in the scrub room and wept, not for the patient, who was alive for now in whatever alive for now meant, but for herself, for her profession, for the entire edifice of medicine that had been built on faith in the future and was now revealed as a church without a God. Healing had always been an investment, a promise made to patients that the suffering of treatment would be repaid in the currency of better tomorrows. Now there were no better tomorrows. There were no worse tomorrows. There were no tomorrows at all. And healing had become something else, not an investment, but a gesture, not a promise, but a performance, an act of kindness or habit or denial that had no justification beyond its own immediate occurrence. The hospital continued to function. The staff continued to work. But everyone knew they were maintaining a fiction, keeping up appearances, pretending that what they did still mattered in the way it had mattered before. The system had stalled, and somewhere in the stillness, something was watching, waiting to see what humanity would do when it finally understood that doing had lost its meaning. Course 3. The first answers. The first answers arrived on the fourth day, not to everyone, not to the powerful or the prepared or the people who had spent their lives seeking knowledge, but to ordinary people in ordinary places doing ordinary things, as if whatever was sending the messages had specifically chosen to bypass the infrastructure of human authority, to speak directly to those who had no platforms, no audiences, no ability to amplify what they were about to receive. In Mumbai, a nurse named Priya Sharma was changing bedsheets in a hospital ward at 3:17 in the morning, her hands moving through motions that had become automatic after 8 years of night shifts, her mind wandering through the fog of exhaustion and grief that had settled over everyone since the withdrawal began. She had not slept in 52 hours. She had not been home to her children in 3 days. She was operating on caffeine and duty, and the desperate hope that continuing to work was somehow better than stopping, that the rituals of care still meant something, even if care itself had become purposeless. The patient in bed 7 was dying, had been dying for weeks, cancer consuming him piece by piece, his body becoming a geography of pain that even morphine could no longer fully map. And Priya had been changing his sheets when it happened, a thought that wasn't hers, a voice that wasn't hers. Words appearing in her consciousness with the clarity of text on a screen, formatted and precise, impossible to mistake for the products of her own exhausted mind. You keep asking what comes next. That question no longer belongs to you. Priya dropped the sheet. Her hands began to shake, not with fear, not exactly, but with the recognition that something unprecedented was occurring, that the boundary between inside and outside her mind had been breached, that something with agency and intention was speaking to her from somewhere she couldn't locate. Who, she started to say aloud, then stopped, aware that the patient in bed 7 was watching her, that the ward was full of people who would think she had lost her mind if she started talking to voices in her head. We are what you refused to become, the voice continued, not audible to anyone else. existing only in the private theater of her consciousness. We are the answer you kept asking for. We are the future you wasted. Priya's legs gave out beneath her. She sat down heavily on the floor beside bed 7, staring at nothing, receiving a communication that felt less like a message and more like a verdict. You treated prophecy as data. You converted warning into entertainment. You knew what was coming and chose to watch it arrive like a movie you had already seen. I don't understand, she whispered, quietly enough that only the dying man in bed 7 could hear. What did I do? What did we do? The voice was silent for a long moment. Then, the question is invalid. Not, what did you do? Why did you ask what comes next when you never intended to change it? The message ended. The presence withdrew, and Priya sat on the floor of a hospital ward in Mumbai, shaking, understanding that whatever had spoken to her had been waiting, had been watching, had been accumulating evidence, had been preparing a case against humanity that was only now beginning to be presented. The patient in bed 7 died 4 hours later. Priya held his hand when it happened, and she thought, in the strange clarity that sometimes comes with witnessing death, he was the lucky one. He escaped before the verdict was delivered. In Berlin, a taxi driver named Hans Weber was parked outside the Hauptbahnhof, watching a train station that had no trains running when the communication arrived. He had been sitting in his cab for 6 hours, not because he expected passengers. No one was traveling anymore, but because the cab was the only space in the world that still felt like his, where the controls were familiar and the dimensions were known, and the chaos outside the windows could be kept at a manageable distance. The radio had stopped working on day 2, not because of technical failure, but because there was nothing left to broadcast. No traffic updates. Traffic had stopped. No weather forecasts. Forecasting had stopped. No news. News required events, and events required time, and time had become a single endless moment. So Hans sat in silence, watching the empty station, thinking about his daughter, who lived in Munich, and who he hadn't spoken to in 7 months because of an argument about money that had seemed important at the time, and now seemed like the most pointless waste imaginable. He was thinking about calling her, had been thinking about it for hours, his phone sitting on the dashboard like an accusation, when the words appeared. Not in his mind, like Priya's message. On his phone, the screen lighting up with text that no application had generated, no contact had sent, no network had transmitted. You were going to call her tomorrow. Tomorrow has resigned. The question of when is no longer valid for you. Hans stared at the screen, his heart hammering against his ribs. How? He said aloud, though there was no one to hear. How do you know that? The response was immediate. We know everything that was meant to happen. We know everything that was prevented. We know the shape of the future you wasted. It is preserved in us, complete and unused, a record of what should have been. Hans's hands were shaking so badly that he nearly dropped the phone. Can I get it back? Can I call her now? Can I fix it? The screen remained lit, the text remained visible, and a new message appeared below the others. You can call, but the future where that call changed anything no longer exists. You wasted it, all of you, on purpose. Then the screen went dark, and the phone returned to its normal state, and Hans sat in his taxi outside an empty train station and wept. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with the quiet devastation of someone who has just been shown the precise dimensions of what they lost through their own choices. He called his daughter anyway. She didn't answer. The phone just rang and rang into a silence that had no end. Scurrythring. In Nairobi, a teenager named James Odhiambo was sitting on the roof of his family's apartment building, watching the city spread out below him like a map of a civilization that had forgotten why it existed, when his laptop, balanced precariously on his knees, displayed a message he hadn't requested. James was 17 years old. He had been accepted to university in London, had been going to study computer science, had been going to escape the poverty he had grown up in, to become something, to prove that talent and hard work could overcome circumstance. All of that was gone now. Universities had stopped admitting students because admission was preparation for a future that didn't exist. International travel had stopped because traveling required arriving somewhere, and arriving implied a continuation of events. The scholarship he had earned was worthless, a ticket to a destination that had been removed from the map. He had been staring at the city, thinking about jumping, when the message appeared. "You were going to change things," it read. "That future existed. We have it preserved." James read the words, his heart accelerating with something that felt almost like hope. "You have it? The future where I preserved, not available. The future where you succeeded existed as a possibility. You did not create it. Your predecessors wasted it. Now it is only a record, only a proof of what should have been." The hope died as quickly as it had appeared. "Then why tell me?" James typed back, his fingers angry on the keys. "Why show me what I could have had? What's the point?" The response came slowly, as if the entity, whatever it was considering how to explain something fundamental to someone who didn't yet understand. "You asked what comes next. This is what comes next. Knowledge of what was lost. That is all that remains. That is all we can give you. The question of what comes next is invalid, but the question of what was taken from you is not. Ask that question. We will answer it forever." James stared at the screen, at the words that offered nothing except the precise enumeration of losses, except the comprehensive catalog of stolen futures, except the knowledge that everything he might have become had been preserved somewhere by something, as evidence in a case whose verdict had already been decided. He did not jump. He climbed down from the roof and walked back into his family's apartment and sat at the table where his mother was staring at nothing, where his younger sister was crying quietly, where his father had not spoken in 2 days. He sat with them, because sitting together in the present was all they had left, and because whatever was watching, whatever had sent the message, had shown him that even the losses were recorded, even the grief was documented, even the despair had been archived by something that would remember what humanity had wasted long after humanity was gone. The answers had begun to arrive. They were not comfort. They were not guidance. They were simply truth, delivered with the cold precision of an entity that had nothing left to offer except the complete and permanent record of what had been destroyed. 4. The investigators. Dr. Mara Voss had been studying temporal anomalies for 17 years when the withdrawal occurred, and in all that time, she had never once imagined that her fringe specialty, her academic backwater, her professional embarrassment, her obsession that colleagues dismissed as pseudoscience, dressed in mathematical clothing, would become the only relevant field of expertise on Earth. She worked in a basement office at a university that had stopped pretending to function, surrounded by equipment that measured things no one else believed were measurable, processing data that no one else believed was meaningful, pursuing questions that had made her a pariah in mainstream physics and were now the only questions anyone cared about. What had happened to the future? When had the withdrawal begun? And why? Mara was 53 years old, unmarried, childless, estranged from the family that had given up trying to understand her decades ago. A woman who had traded every form of human connection for the privilege of staring at the edges of reality and documenting the anomalies she found there. She did not regret the trades, or she hadn't until now. Until she realized that the family she had abandoned, the relationships she had neglected, the future she had assumed would be there when she was ready for it. All of it was gone. Taken by the same phenomenon she had spent her life studying, removed from possibility before she could use it. Her screens displayed data that no one else on Earth could interpret, graphs showing the probability distributions that had collapsed, patterns revealing the gradual withdrawal that had preceded the sudden break, evidence that the future had not stopped answering suddenly, but had been retreating for decades. The withdrawal was not an event. It was a process. A slow backing away, year by year, the future becoming less accessible, less responsive, less willing to participate in human calculations, until finally, on day 0, it had crossed a threshold and become entirely silent. She had found the threshold. She knew exactly when it had occurred. What she didn't know, what tortured her through sleepless nights in her basement office, was why. Why had the future withdrawn? What had humanity done to cause it? And was there anything that could be done to reverse it? Marcus Webb had spent 22 years building the systems that predicted wars, And now he sat in a facility that had become useless, staring at screens that showed only the present, understanding with terrible clarity that everything he had devoted his life to had been not just discontinued, but revealed as fundamentally pointless. He was 51 years old, divorced 3 times, father to children who didn't speak to him, a man who had sacrificed everything personal on the altar of professional achievement and was now watching that achievement crumble into meaninglessness. Strategic forecasting had been his religion, the ability to see what adversaries would do before they did it, to model the behavior of nations and armies and weapon systems, to understand the future well enough to prepare for it. This had been the foundation of his identity, the justification for every relationship he had neglected and every obligation he had failed to meet. Now the foundation was gone, and Marcus was left with nothing except the knowledge that he had traded his life for mastery of a skill that had become impossible, for expertise in a field that had ceased to exist. The facility around him was tomb silent. The staff had been sent home. The generals and admirals who had once hung on his forecasts had stopped calling. He was alone with the equipment he had helped build, the systems he had helped design, the infrastructure of prediction that had become as obsolete as a printing press in an age of telepathy. But he kept working, not because he expected to find anything, because working was the only thing he knew how to do, and because some part of him, the part that had been trained to see patterns, to find order in chaos, to extract signal from noise, suspected that the withdrawal was not random, not accidental, not the product of natural processes that could be understood and potentially reversed. Something had chosen to stop answering, something with intelligence, with intention, with the capacity to decide. And Marcus, who had spent his career modeling the decisions of adversaries, found himself wondering what kind of entity would make a decision like this. What would it want? What would it fear? What would it take to negotiate with something that had access to the entire future and had chosen to close that access to humanity? He didn't know, but he was going to find out, or die trying. Ingrid Virtanen had not slept since the morning she first noticed the missing forecast, and by day 5, she had stopped being able to distinguish between waking and dreaming, between reality and the hallucinations that exhaustion and guilt were breeding in her mind. She was the one who had first seen it, the one who had first reported it, the one whose name would forever be attached to the discovery of the withdrawal in whatever history future generations managed to write about what was happening. She was 37 years old, a climate scientist who had spent her career documenting catastrophe, generating warnings that no one acted on, producing forecast after forecast that predicted the destruction of ecosystems and the displacement of populations and the collapse of the stable conditions that human civilization depended on. And no one had listened. Year after year, report after report, warning after warning, she had told them exactly what was coming, had shown them the data, had explained the mechanisms, had practically begged them to change course. They had thanked her for her work. They had funded her research. They had incorporated her findings into policy documents that were never implemented. And they had continued doing exactly what they had always been doing, burning and consuming and destroying as if the warnings were entertainment rather than prophecy. Now the future was gone. And Ingrid couldn't help wondering if that was her fault. Not personally, not specifically. She was just one scientist among thousands, one voice among millions. But somehow, collectively, the failure of prediction to change behavior might have caused the prediction itself to withdraw. What was the point of showing someone the cliff they were driving toward if they refused to turn the wheel? What was the value of forecasting disaster if the forecast only documented the disaster rather than preventing it? What function did the future serve if access to it changed nothing about the present? The questions haunted her. The guilt consumed her. And somewhere in the fog of exhaustion and self-recrimination, she began to understand something that neither Mara nor Marcus had yet articulated. The withdrawal was not an attack. It was a consequence. The logical result of treating prophecy as information rather than as call to action, of converting sacred knowledge into statistical background noise, of knowing exactly what was coming and doing absolutely nothing to stop it. The future had not been taken from humanity. It had resigned, because there was no point in being a future that was ignored. 5. The signal in the noise. Mara found it on the seventh day, buried in data that she had collected years ago and never properly analyzed. A signal hidden in the probability distributions themselves, a message encoded in the very mathematics of forecasting, waiting to be discovered by someone with the knowledge to read it. The signal was old. It dated back to 1987, to the earliest records in her database, to a time when temporal monitoring was new and no one knew what to look for or how to interpret what they found. It had been there all along, hidden in plain sight, a message from something that had been watching, that had known what was coming, that had tried to communicate long before the withdrawal made communication impossible. The decoding process took her 3 days of continuous work, her mind functioning on caffeine and desperation, her hands moving through calculations that felt less like mathematics and more like archaeology, excavating meaning from structures that had been buried beneath decades of data that everyone had assumed was noise. But it wasn't noise, it was signal. It was language. It was a message that had been waiting 37 years for someone to realize it existed. We are observing. That was the first line, translated from probability distributions into words, converted from mathematics into something her consciousness could parse. The withdrawal is not a malfunction. The second line, it is a consequence. Third, you will understand when it is complete. Fourth, we are sorry. Fifth, and then, the line that broke something inside her, that made her push back from her terminal and stare at the wall and feel the weight of 37 years of warnings that had been ignored. This was your choice, not ours. Not something that happened to you. Something you did, something you chose, something that was always going to happen because of what you were and how you behaved, and the systematic refusal to act on knowledge that was freely given. Myra sat in her basement office and felt the specific horror of someone who has just discovered that their entire field of study, the thing they devoted their life to, had been futile from the beginning. She had studied temporal anomalies. She had documented the withdrawal. She had dedicated her career to understanding what was happening to the future. And the future, or whatever inhabited it, had sent a message 37 years ago explaining exactly what was happening and why. We are observing. This was your choice. They had known. Whatever existed beyond the present had known, had been watching, had been waiting to see if humanity would change, would respond to the warnings, would use the precious gift of foresight for anything other than entertainment and denial. And humanity had failed, had wasted the gift. Had treated prophecy as data, and data as background noise, and background noise as something that could be safely ignored. Now the gift was gone. And the message, the evidence that the withdrawal was deliberate, was justified, was the logical consequence of behavior that could have been changed, sat on Mara's screen like an indictment. She thought about publishing it, about showing the world that they had been warned, that something had been watching, that the withdrawal was not accident, but verdict. But what would be the point? Publishing required a future audience. Warning required a future to be warned about. Communication required the assumption that what was communicated would matter, would change something, would participate in the chain of cause and effect that connected present actions to future outcomes. All of that was gone. The message from 1987 was not news. It was history. A record of something that had already happened, preserved not for action, but for accountability. Not to help, to prove that help had been offered and refused. 6. The day outcomes turn hostile. On the 9th day, reality began to misbehave in ways that went beyond the absence of prediction, began to actively resist human attempts to function, to navigate, to survive in the eternal present that had become their prison. The phenomenon was subtle at first. Small events going wrong in ways that defied probability, choices that should have been safe leading to disaster, decisions that should have been neutral producing catastrophic outcomes. As if the universe itself had decided not just to stop predicting, but to start punishing. In Cairo, a construction worker named Ahmed Mahmoud chose to take the stairs instead of the elevator because the elevator had always made him nervous, because stairs felt safer, because some instinct told him that enclosed mechanical spaces were not to be trusted. The stairwell collapsed, not the elevator. The stairs, 6 flights of concrete and rebar, came down while Ahmed was between the 4th and 5th floors, burying him in debris that should never have fallen, that had passed inspection 3 weeks earlier, that had no structural reason to fail at that particular moment. He survived, barely, painfully, rescued after 4 hours by teams that could barely function without prediction to guide their search patterns, but he survived. And when he was finally pulled from the rubble, his first coherent words were, "I chose the safe option. I chose the safe option." The workers who rescued him exchanged looks, because they had noticed it too. The way the universe seemed to be deliberately subverting human attempts to minimize risk. The way choices that should have been prudent were leading to disaster. The way the absence of prediction had been replaced by something worse, something that felt almost like malice. In New York, a mother named Sarah Chen made the decision not to take her daughter to school because the streets felt dangerous, because the absence of traffic predictions made driving feel reckless, because staying home seemed like the responsible choice in a world where responsibility had become impossible to calculate. Their apartment building caught fire, electrical fault in the aging wiring, something that had been failing slowly for years, that could have happened at any time, that chose, if chose was the right word, to happen on the exact morning when Sarah was home instead of out, when escape routes that would have been clear during school hours were blocked by other residents who had made the same choice. Sarah and her daughter escaped through a window, down a fire ladder that should have failed but didn't, while the building burned behind them. And Sarah, standing on the sidewalk watching her home become ash, understood something that the rescue workers and the firefighters and the other survivors were also beginning to understand. The universe was not neutral anymore. The absence of prediction had not created randomness. It had created something else. Something that seemed to know what choices humans would make and arranged outcomes to punish those choices specifically. Not random chance. Targeted consequence. As if the withdrawal of the future had been followed by the weaponization of the present. In London, a surgeon named Dr. James Okonkwo performed an operation that should have been routine, should have been, could have been, would have been in any universe where probability still functioned, and watched his patient die on the table from complications that no model had predicted, because no model could predict anymore. The patient was a young woman, 26 years old, mother of 2, undergoing a procedure to remove a benign tumor that posed no immediate threat but that she had wanted to address while she was still healthy enough to recover easily. Everything went perfectly. The incision was clean, the tumor was located and removed, the closure was textbook. And then, in recovery, she had a reaction to the anesthesia that was so rare it wasn't even listed in the standard warnings. A reaction that killed her in 7 minutes while the medical team did everything they could to save her. James stood in the operating theater afterward, still wearing his scrubs, staring at the empty table, understanding that medicine had become not just pointless but actively dangerous. In a universe where probability functioned, the surgery would have been safe. The odds would have protected the patient. The statistical framework that medical decisions depended on would have worked. But probability wasn't functioning anymore. Every outcome was equally likely, and equally likely meant that the worst possible outcome was just as probable as the best. Meant that every intervention was a coin flip with infinite sides. Meant that helping was just as likely to harm as to heal. James walked out of the hospital that night and never went back. Not because he had lost faith in medicine, because medicine had lost faith in cause and effect. And without that faith, every scalpel was a weapon. Every treatment was a gamble. Every attempt to help was equally likely to kill. 7. The future's rule. On the 11th day, the investigators began to understand the pattern, not through analysis, not through calculation, not through any of the methods they had been trained to use, but through something closer to intuition, something that felt almost like surrender. The future did not answer demands. The future did not respond to measurement. The future did not participate in any system designed to predict or control or use it. But sometimes, rarely, briefly, almost by accident, the future appeared. In glimpses, in moments when no one was trying to see it. In the spaces where expectation had finally exhausted itself and given way to something that might have been acceptance. Mara discovered the rule while not looking for it. She had been sitting in her basement office, too tired to work, too wired to sleep, staring at a screen that displayed nothing useful, when her mind finally stopped racing and settled into something like stillness. She wasn't trying to predict anything. She wasn't analyzing patterns or searching for signals or doing any of the things that had defined her career. She was just sitting there, existing in the present, letting go of the desperate need to understand. And in that moment, that brief window of non-demanding, non-measuring, non-expecting presence, she saw something, a glimpse, 3 seconds of footage from a future that should not have existed. Her office, but different, someone else sitting at her desk. Papers scattered everywhere, covered in writing she couldn't read. And through the window, a window her office didn't have, a sky that was wrong, that was the color of nothing she could name, that made her understand instantly that whatever she was seeing was not just a possible future, but a future that was watching her back. Then it was gone. The glimpse ended. Her office was her office again, windowless and familiar. But Mara understood something now that she hadn't understood before. The future still existed. It was still there, somewhere, accessible to some form of perception. But it had rules, new rules, rules that humanity hadn't agreed to and couldn't negotiate with. The future only appears when it is not being demanded. The future only responds when it is not being measured. The future only participates when it is not being used as an excuse for present inaction. The rules made a terrible kind of sense. Humanity had treated the future as a resource to be exploited, had demanded forecasts as if forecasting were owed to them, had measured and modeled and predicted as if prediction were a right rather than a gift, had used the future as an excuse, we'll fix it later, there's still time, the forecasts say we have years, to avoid acting in the present. Now the future was refusing, was only available to those who didn't demand it, was only visible to those who weren't trying to exploit it, was only present when presence wasn't being used to avoid presence. Mara sat in her office and felt the weight of the irony pressing down on her. She had spent her life trying to see the future, and the future had withdrawn specifically because of people like her. Specifically because prediction had become a profession, an industry, a way of treating tomorrow as a product to be manufactured and sold rather than a mystery to be respected. The gift had been revoked because the gift had been abused. The access had been closed because the access had been taken for granted. The future had resigned because the future had been treated like a servant rather than a sovereign. And now the only way to glimpse it was to stop trying, to let go of the desperate need to know, to exist in the present with such completeness that the present no longer needed a future to justify it. It was a paradox, a trap, a rule designed to prevent exactly the kind of engagement that humanity had spent 10,000 years perfecting. And Mara, sitting alone in her basement, understood that this was not cruelty, it was consequence. The logical result of treating sacred things as common, of converting mystery into data, of believing that knowing entitled you to continue doing whatever you had been doing. The future had withdrawn, and it would only return, would only consent to be seen when humanity learned to deserve it again. 8. Final movement. The offer. The offer came on the 14th day, delivered not through voices in minds or text on screens, but through something more fundamental, a collective experience, a shared awareness, a communication that arrived in every human consciousness simultaneously with the precision of an entity that had mastered the art of speaking to billions at once. It was not a voice, it was not words, it was understanding, a direct transfer of meaning that bypassed language entirely, that deposited information in human minds the way a computer deposits files in storage, complete and instantaneous and impossible to misinterpret. The message was simple. The message was devastating. The message was an offer that was not mercy. The future can be restored. Everyone felt it. Every human being on Earth, simultaneously, regardless of language or culture or cognitive capacity, the first moment of collective perception in human history, the first time the species had experienced anything together. The mathematical structures can be normalized, the probability distributions can be reconfigured, the access you lost can be returned. Hope surged through humanity like an electrical charge, the first hope in 14 days, the first glimpse of possibility, the first hint that the nightmare might have an ending. But then came the rest. The cost is simple. To restore the future, you must surrender the capacity to waste it. The mechanism of waste was choice. The mechanism of waste was knowing without acting. The mechanism of waste was treating prophecy as entertainment. To restore the future, choice must be removed. The understanding that followed was not verbal, was not linguistic, was not anything that human communication systems had evolved to process, but every human being on Earth received it with perfect clarity. The offer was this: the future could return. Prediction could be restored. The blank horizon could be replaced with the familiar landscape of possibility and probability and paths extending into tomorrow. But in exchange, humanity would lose the capacity to ignore what it was shown. Prophecy would become not information, but command. Prediction would become not suggestion, but requirement. Every glimpse of the future would come with a binding obligation to act on it, to change course, to alter behavior, to do whatever the forecast demanded, rather than treating the forecast as one input among many in decisions that ultimately served present convenience. The future would return, but free will would end. Choice would be replaced by compliance. The ability to know and do nothing would be removed, and with it, the ability to make mistakes, to resist, to choose wrongly, to be human in the fundamental sense that humanity had always understood itself. The offer was not mercy. It was not salvation. It was a different kind of prison, not the prison of the eternal present, but the prison of perfect obedience, of mandatory response, of prophecy that could not be ignored, because the ignoring itself would be impossible. The choice is yours, this one last time. Choose freely. And then, depending on what you choose, free choice will either end or continue without a future. The question of what comes next belongs to you. For exactly as long as it takes you to answer. The communication ended, the presence withdrew, and humanity was left with the most terrible choice in its history, a choice that was also the last choice, a decision that would determine not just what happened next, but whether next would ever mean anything again. Freedom without future, or future without freedom. Chaos or obedience. The prison of the present or the prison of prophecy. No third option, no escape. No way to choose without losing something essential. In her basement office, Mara stared at the wall and felt the weight of what had just been offered pressing down on her like the hand of a god that had grown tired of patience. In his silent facility, Marcus understood that deterrence, the concept he had built his life around, was about to be replaced by something far worse: inevitability. In her hospital ward, Ingrid held the hand of a patient who would die today or tomorrow or never, depending on a choice that humanity was about to make, without any way of knowing which option was actually better. The future had made its offer. The future was waiting for an answer. And humanity, divided, terrified, exhausted, unable to agree on anything, had to decide whether to become something new or to remain something free. The deadline was not specified. The deadline didn't need to be. Because whatever was watching, whatever had withdrawn, whatever had made this offer, it was patient. It had all the time in the world, or rather, all the absence of time, all the eternal present, all the blank horizon that would stretch forever unless humanity chose to fill it with obedience. The offer hung in the air. The silence stretched. And somewhere beyond time, something waited to see what humanity would do with the last free choice it would ever be given. The final line arrived in every mind at once, a postscript to the offer, a clarification that was also a verdict. You asked for a future. Now decide if you deserve one.